Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1163 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. Really, my only complaint about this chapter is I wish it was longer. The end just felt so freaking abrupt. Kind of feel like Thor when he's drinking coffee, you know? Another, please? I need more. But anyway, just to be straight up 100% honest with you, I don't think that there's too much in this chapter that is like legitimately shocking. I am shocked about none of this. And to me, at the very least, it's just another reminder that you don't literally have to heel turn everywhere to make a story that is worth reading, that has my jaw on the floor, because we got basically what I think we were all expecting to some degree, and it was still freaking incredible. I almost want to call it fan service. We wanted it, and we got it. But yeah, guys, let's do the thing that we normally do and talk about how genius Oda was and how he mapped out this chapter, as well as tinfoil headcanon and all the reading between the lines. But I suppose before we get into the chapter itself, I missed this last week. I guess the Yamato cover story is over, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm glad that is the case. Aside from the reveal of Kozuki Moria, probably not one of my favorite cover stories ever. Actually, I might rank it last. It was neither particularly funny, nor as consequential. It didn't feel as consequential as others. Not that it isn't good in its own way and you can like it or whatever. It seemed to be celebrating Japanese culture. Maybe like Oda had a bunch of notes about Japan that he wanted to include in Wano itself and couldn't include it all, so then it became part of the cover story. I don't know, but it wasn't for me. But now that it is officially over, I feel like we can sort of summarize what it accomplished. It seems likely that Yamato has acquired the former Beast Pirates to be a part of her crew, and I imagine now that Wano is at peace, we're going to see Yamato make some sort of movement in the story. Basically, you know, it's possible that Yamato is on a crash course to joining the crew, or more likely than that, joining the Grand Fleet. I just don't think that Yamato is going to set out to the sea alone, and if this includes the former members of the Beast Pirates essentially inheriting her father's crew, then they're not all going to join the Straw Hats. They'll need a captain, and that should be Yamato. But I suppose just to explain this right? The reason that Yamato didn't join Luffy post-Wano probably comes down to two things. One is the overt reason, and one is more of the reading between the lines reason. The overt reason is that before Odin set out to the sea, Odin first adventured across Wano, and Yamato wanted to duplicate this. But if you read between the lines, the actual reason I think that Yamato chose to do this is because Yamato realized that the country of Wano and Momonosuke still needed help. Momonosuke is basically going through a training arc with his Devil Fruit, and at the end of the arc, when Admiral Green Bull showed up, Momonosuke didn't want to involve the Straw Hats because it was important to him that Wano could take care of itself, and Yamato was there to observe this, and I think realized that Momonosuke wasn't quite yet ready to shoulder this burden himself. So despite Yamato having an open invite into the crew and basically telling everyone, and the readers included, that this was going to happen, the plan changed. But I suppose the reason why I was shocked by where this cover story ended more than anything else is I was really anticipating the cover story ending with some kind of bang. It makes you wonder about what will happen to Wano after Yamato leaves. Because this is sort of an open-ended question. Blackbeard now knows that the Pluton is there. The country is in danger for a number of different reasons as well. So yeah, I mean, it could end up being a big deal that, like, not the cover story itself, but the moment Yamato leaves. At some point, the Pluton needs to be released or retrieved, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me for the Straw Hat Pirates to do that, to go back to Wano anytime soon. So, you know, maybe immediately after this is when it would have gotten interesting. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. This leads us into the actual chapter, which continues from the last one, where Imu is now possessing Saturn's body and just going ham on God Valley. You guys should know by now that pretty much everything that happens in the story reminds me of other things that have happened in the story, and as I was reading this, my first thought was this reminded me a lot of the Chichibukai in Marineford. Mainly Boa Hancock, but I also think Doflamingo and Mihawk as well. It might even be others. But if you take yourself back to Boa Hancock in Marineford for sure, she was offing basically everyone, ally or enemy, marine or pirate, it didn't matter. As far as the war was concerned, she wasn't on anybody's side, other than Luffy. Luffy was like the exception. And this is most definitely Imu's vibe here. And also I think similar but different to Boa Hancock, Imu has a reason for doing this. Boa Hancock's reason was like she was trying to maintain the idea that she was still on the world government's side. So she pretended like, look, I'm just attacking people and Marines just happen to get in the way. I'm not actually your enemy. So Boa was trying to maintain a lie. Likewise, it seems to me that Imu probably doesn't want all of these Marines there witnessing them, their existence, Saturn's transformation, all of that. All of these Marines are going to have to be killed, most likely. Like, if you recall from earlier in the story, I can't remember if this was actually during the Reverie or not, but we learned that anybody who happened to stumble upon Imu found themselves disappeared a short time later. So this should really be the same. It could be, just the same as Boa Hancock, Imu is killing everyone in order to maintain a lie. But at the same time, the other half of my brain is like, does Imu really need a reason to kill people indiscriminately? People that they see as bothersome insects? Probably not. If you just told me that Imu is full of rage or hate and anger, and this is, what they really want to do, I wouldn't be shocked. Which, as it turns out, is probably another thing that you could relate back to Boa Hancock. Remember, when we first met Boa Hancock, she was very different to the person that she is now. She would regularly transform innocent people into statues, and some of them would die. She didn't care. And her reasoning for doing this is, well, I'm the most beautiful. Because of this, I can do whatever it is that I want to. Which is most likely a very Emu way of thinking about the world. I'm the king of the world. I can do what I want to. And guess what? The people will still worship me. The same as Boa Hancock's beauty. I'm certain that a lot of people don't really think about it this way, but we love worshiping power. And beauty, being the most beautiful, is another form of power. Two different variations of false idols. But yeah, speaking of power, if anybody was questioning just how strong Imu was, well, this chapter gave you your answer. All of this was just pure fan service. We can see that Imu has attacked some of Roger's crew, and Roger's like, look, I gotta fight this thing. Gabon's like, seriously, bro? Meanwhile, Garp is doing the same thing, and Garp also confirms that he had never seen one of the Gorosei before now, and was not anticipating any of this. So while Rox is staring down Imu, who the Marines know is basically Saturn, I think that's the extent of what they know. The Marines are like, so should we help? Should we provide backup? And Garp's like, yeah, we should. And they immediately realize, wait a second, well, for who are we going to provide backup? So a bit later, we literally see Garp drag them so he can help out Rox fight Imu. Then if you recall, Kaido and Whitebeard were already by Rox's side. Big Mom shows up as well, and so all of them, Roger, Rox, Garp, Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido all attack Imu at the same time with their finishing moves. Which of course didn't work. In fact, it didn't even kind of work. But it was incredibly awesome. I'm seriously over here thinking about what exactly is the destructive power of everything these 6 people unleash in that moment. I honestly feel like the whole island should have just instantly vaporized. Straight up, there probably should have been a hole in the ground like Enies Lobby. But yeah, whatever it is it takes to kill Imu, they didn't have it. And to add insult to injury, not only was Imu totally unfazed by this, but at the end of the chapter, Imu transforms Rox into a demon using Domi Reversi, which we'll obviously talk about more, but just on the surface level, Imu's power scaling level right now is through the roof, because basically there is no defeating them. You can't, if these 6 people with their strongest attacks couldn't kill them, and then on top of that, they're capable of flipping them into their own servant demons, like, good lord. In fact, I wouldn't even put Imu on the power scaling tier list. You know how people do the tier list of like S tier or S plus tier? No, either you don't include Imu at all, or you create a new tier called the BS tier. You guys think I'm joking, but you really need the bullshit tier to include Imu at all, because it's very likely that Imu's powers work in some way that once you figure it out, he won't be or cannot be this strong. Anyway, I'm not entirely sure of how I want to dig into all this, so maybe it's just the best spot to just talk about Imu's powers and some speculations. The first thing that stood out to me is Imu's possession of Saturn seems a bit different than Imu's possession of Gunko, and I wonder if there's some sort of reason for that. Like, take yourself back a few chapters in Elbaf, Imu possesses Gunko but still retains mostly Gunko's appearance. What's going on here with Saturn is different, and I just wonder if this has something to do with the fact that Gunko still has a body. Like, Gunko is not as old as Saturn is. We saw that Imu ended Saturn and then he quickly disintegrated into bones. And those bones quickly turned to ash. So it just leaves me thinking that Saturn's body mostly doesn't really exist. Perhaps gives Imu more control over transforming him. But I'm also still wondering, and maybe in part I'm biased because I hope for this, but I think it'd be really cool if there are different kinds of contracts that Imu could have with different individuals. Like, for instance, I think that what's going on with Rox at the end of this chapter is most likely different than Gunko and Saturn, but it's also possible that Imu's contract with Gunko is different from Saturn. And, I just feel like this would make what Imu does more convoluted, and to me at least, more interesting. But the main difference that I've been sort of highlighting over the last few chapters is with Rox, right? Rox is being Domi Reversi transformed unwillingly. Same is true of Dory and Brogy. They're not wanting this. It intuitively makes more sense to me that if somebody willingly engages in a contract with Imu, that bond, something about that would just be stronger. Imu would have greater control. So if you just look at this visually, right, I think that there's a lot more similarity between Gunko, when she transformed, and Dory and Brogy and Rox than what is happening here with Saturn, right? Like, Gunko looked like a demon, looked like she was transformed into a demon. Saturn looks like, Saturn, but with Imu's head on top. And just narratively speaking, I think it would make sense for Oda to reserve Imu's most powerful possessions to the Gorosei. Like, in the future, if we fight Imu, I feel as though it's much more likely that we'll see a Gorosei possessed by Imu rather than somebody lesser than that. So the way that I sort of break this down, or it could make sense to me, right? Imu is able to clearly transform those that are unwilling. But Imu could also transform those that are willing but are being manipulated. So this is my pseudo headcanon, I guess, an idea to throw out in the dark regarding Gunko. Basically, Gunko willingly made a deal with the devil, but that deal was something like the devil will give Gunko something that she desires, some sort of treasure, at the cost of her soul. And then the most powerful transformation is if they literally swear allegiance to Imu willingly. But obviously with all of this, we will see. But yeah, if we're specifically talking about this chapter and what Saturn and Imu are doing, there's this really interesting moment where obviously Saturn is this like spider creature and has many legs, but there were almost black hockey marks on the legs, which then suddenly separated from his legs, and then, as it seems to me, became tangible, real legs on their own. So I see this as being some kind of parallel or inversion or foil of Nika's abilities. Basically, there's something related to Imu's powers and shadow, but Imu can turn shadow into reality, or maybe nightmares into reality. And with Nika, it's obviously dreams or imagination becomes reality. But as a side note, I still think that there's a lot of untapped potential with Gear 5th and with Nika. If you look at what Imu is doing in this chapter, it just wouldn't shock me if Luffy could weaponize Nika in a similar way. Essentially, Luffy in Gear 5th can literally do anything. Anything that he can dream of. Anything that he can imagine he can accomplish, right? And so we still need to go through these extra steps of Luffy really figuring out that there's no limits to what he can accomplish. Even potentially growing a few extra arms if that idea strikes him. But this is a bit off topic. To go back to Imu, right, the most important question in all of this is if all of these, the strongest people in the world, all attack Imu simultaneously and it doesn't kill them, then how in the world can Imu be defeated, period? And also implicit within this question is what exactly is the trick that's going on here that we might have the ability to figure out? So eventually I will attempt to answer this question, but the first thing that I probably need to point out to you is that there are some things said in this chapter which make me want to compare Imu to other villains prior in the story. We know Oda likes to foreshadow everywhere, and with an in-game villain like Imu, it should be no exception. So if you've been observant, a pattern is starting to form. In Elbaf, Imu does not travel to Elbaf itself, per se. Imu possesses Gunko's body. Now, in God Valley, right? Imu again is not technically here as far as we know how this works, right? Imu seems to be possessing Saturn's body or requires one of their servants to be here. And I think that this aligns really well with the end of the chapter. Mu sort of rises into the sky and then observes Rox's family, right? And then Rox notices this, whatever you're thinking, don't do it. And Imu says, Mu, I will do nothing. It's gonna be you that does it for me. So I think that it's fair to speculate at this moment that Imu prefers other people, their subordinates, accomplish their tasks for them. Essentially, Imu is lazy. Quick, who does this remind you of? Well, the first name that should come to mind is Gecko Moria, the shadow guy from Thriller Bark. Moria actually spent a good chunk of that arc sitting on his butt, while his literal shadow was fighting Luffy for him. Another character that I think shares some similarities with all of this is Big Mom. Big Mom, the soul fruit person, ideally wanted her crew and her homies to accomplish her tasks for her. Now, we can't forget that Big Mom also has trust issues. She has dominance issues, right? She's very commandeering, so that kind of negates some of this. But in a perfect world, this is what Big Mom wanted. So Imu having similar characteristics as the Shadow Guy and the Soul Woman, something that, immediately that makes a lot of sense. And probably a lot of you out there have forgotten that this character exists, but also shout out to Black Cat Kuro, otherwise known as Kuro of 1,000 Plans. Kuro's plan in Syrup Village basically was he never intended to fight. His pirate crew arrived, they were supposed to ravage the village while Django hypnotized Kaya so that Kaya would write a will, leaving Clawhador or Kuro as the inheritor of the estate, and ideally, again, Kuro didn't need to do anything. This was actually important so that Kuro's identity could remain secret. Very similar to Imu once again, right? Like, nobody knew that Kuro existed. He was thought to be dead. In reality, all he wanted was for Kaya to write the will and then die, and then the village can stay as they are, and Kuro intended to just live there in like a newfound paradise. So ignoring that his subordinate Django had hypnosis powers that could probably be useful, be Kuro's plan B, and plan A is just that the villagers never know that he was involved in any of this. I really don't think that a lot of people currently have connected Kuro as an Imu-like villain, probably the first in the story, but to me that's very true. And finally, the last character that I want to throw out to you is Sugar from Dressrosa. Similar to how Imu is transforming people into demons, Sugar's thing was to transform them into her toys, which then became her slaves, and that she could play with or control. In my opinion, it is not a coincidence that Sugar was practically immortal. The moment that she ate her devil fruit, her age was locked in. If you didn't know, Sugar is not actually a child. Her powers also erase these people's existence. Once they were transformed into toys, nobody could remember their friends, family, loved ones, etc. It's as though they never existed. And overall, there's a lot of small-scale similarity in Dressrosa to what is happening in the larger world ruled by Imu. So anyway, Sugar is another character who does not actually do any fighting herself. She's a non-combatant. Then utilizing all of these comparisons, right? I think a very intuitive thought to have about Imu is that it might be a big deal to find where Imu actually is to attack them directly. To contradict something that I said earlier, we called Imu lazy because of a comparison between Gecko Moria and Imu, but I don't actually believe Imu is lazy. So Imu utilizing other people or their slaves to accomplish tasks for them could be more like Kuro of 1,000 Plants. It's strategic. Imu doesn't want to put themselves in danger. Perhaps you can think of it like Imu calculates the odds of success, failure, and risk. So the trick in all of this is to find Imu's actual body or force Imu to physically arrive. But actually, while we're here, maybe there is one more character that I want to throw into the pot with powers that may potentially relate to Imu. I want to throw out to you guys Basil Hawkins. Basil Hawkins is the fate guy, and we saw in Wano that his ability was that he could create voodoo dolls which contained people's soul or essence, something to that effect. And whenever you stabbed Basil Hawkins, you actually stabbed one of Hawkins' subordinates. This gave Hawkins extra lives. Basically, you had to kill Hawkins a dozen times to actually finish him off. Something like this for Imu wouldn't shock me. Hell, we could even go back to comparisons with Gecko Moria and Big Mom. Gecko Moria's strongest form at the conclusion of Thriller Bark was he absorbed all the shadows that he had created and collected in Thriller Bark and became this kind of monster. And the way that Luffy defeated him is he punched him until all the shadows were released. Big Mama accomplishes something similar with Soul. She consumed a bit of her own soul or other people's soul and became a monster. But we also see at the end of Whole Cake Island what starvation did to her. It sapped her juice. So in this chapter, it looks like the Alliance, Rox, Roger, Garp, etc., that they didn't do anything to Imu. But this very much could be misleading. Imu could be sustaining some form of damage that we are just not aware of. It also appeared as though Imu was fatigued, maybe that's the right word, fatigued whenever Joy Boy's haki appeared. So to cut to the chase, I believe that Imu might have a reserve of souls, shadow, power, whatever, that they can tap into, that they've essentially collected over the time span of potentially centuries. But this reserve can be diminished. Essentially, if the allies did the same attack an infinite number of times, eventually Imu would run out of juice. So maybe now we've solved one of the problems regarding Imu. The other elephant in the room is the fact that Imu, so far it seems like, can Domi reverse anybody at any time. And I'm sure that you can already guess, but I think that there's probably rules associated with this ability as well. So the first guess, and I saw this mentioned on Twitter, and I think that it's a good idea. So far, we've only seen Imu Domi reverse people in their home country. Dory and Brogy, their home country was Elbaf, they were flipped. Rox and the Davy clan, their home country was God Valley, they were flipped. You'll also notice that although the entire Davy clan was flipped, the person that was spared was Eris, whose home country is not in God Valley. Exactly why Imu's powers would work this way, I'm not entirely certain, but it's on the table as a possibility. This was also something I felt like speculating even more when I read the fan translation, when I read the TCB translation. The official doesn't have the same sort of obvious implications, but Imu comments on Eris and Blackbeard being new Davies or new Davy clan members. They say a pestilence that must not be unleashed upon the world. So to me, this is super interesting if there's some limit on Imu's ability regarding your country of origin or where you call home. Also, I just want to point out that when Imu initially used this ability in Elbaf, part of the dialogue was return home. My current headcanon for the Davy clan is that they've been living in God Valley, and so they've taken spouses or whatever among other people that are living in God Valley. So Eris potentially represents the first new Davy clan member that is not actually from God Valley, or doesn't consider God Valley to be home. So all of this could be clues, and you could reread it and reinterpret it to mean it's not a good thing if the Davy clan leaves God Valley and sets up roots somewhere else, somewhere secret. Imu would lose a bit of power. So this is one potential limit to Imu's abilities. The other, which intuitively occurs to me, is that it requires the person being flipped to have some sort of anger or hatred state of mind. It's possibly not a coincidence that before Imu flips Rox, Imu first sort of goads him. I can see your family, Rox, and something very bad is about to happen to them. This might have been a prerequisite to flipping Rox. Although if it's not this, another really strong possibility is fear. And straight up, this might actually make more sense than anger or hatred, just because there was the possibility that if hatred and anger was required to flip somebody, then Imu might have been able to accomplish it when Rox encountered them in Mary Joie. As it seems to me, the main difference between that event and what is going on now is the fact that Rox's family is here. So perhaps Imu needed to utilize Rox's family to make him fear something. But potentially some additional evidence to this idea is fear is also how Big Mom's abilities work. She requires somebody to fear her in order to take their soul. Also, with Dory and Brogy, a difference between how they were flipped and Rocks now is Dory first, or one of the giants, had their hands cut off. None of that seems to be happening here. So at the time we saw the giants flip, and it just made sense to us. Oh, like flesh, bone, and blood is required in the ritual, but that might not actually have been the purpose of it. The purpose of it could have been to make the giant fear Emu instead. Fear is what was actually required. Either way, I've seen a lot of discourse about Domi Reversi, and there's a lot of people out there that don't like the fact that Emu has this ability. Something about it they don't like. Perhaps it's too powerful. I just want to make it clear that 1, it is very possible that there's limits to this ability, and 2, not only is it possible hypothetically, it's also likely narratively. So there's going to be a workaround. And in the same way that Luffy had the perfect counter to Enel's ability, Enel is another parallel with Emu, god of Skypiea, right? Luffy was made out of rubber, which was the perfect counter to Enel because it does not conduct electricity. In the same way, I think that Emu's powers are not going to be effective against Luffy just innately. And the same is going to apply, in my opinion, to at least most of the Straw Hat crew as well as most of the allies, especially those who have very strong wills. I hope to not eat my words here. Actually, strike that, I might hope to eat my words, but regardless, I don't think that a lot of people currently think that in God Valley, Emu flipped Whitebeard, Kaido, Big Mom, Garp, or Roger, right? So there's like, that itself, if that's true, I assume that it's true, would tell you that Emu cannot use this ability willy-nilly. It's not as broken as you think that it is. And if you told me ahead of time that Oda would create a devil character that would be able to corrupt certain souls, right? As an idea, I just like that. It is strong. I'm not saying that it's not strong. It's strong in a very poignant way that can be countered by a true hero, where in order to survive them and defeat them, you also have to teach the characters, to not fear or not be consumed by hatred, which is kind of a big deal in One Piece. But yeah, I'm not other people, so I can only imagine why they feel the way that they do, and frankly, sorry, but there's a lot of people out there with opinions. They have opinions, but are not necessarily the best at expressing why they have that opinion. So I can only speculate as to why exactly people don't like that Emu Domi reversed Rocks, but my suspicion is they just really liked Rocks as a character and didn't want this to happen to him. Perhaps it has something to do with power scaling and Rocks' individual strength. Actually, I'm not gonna lie to you, we speculated in the last chapter review that Rocks would be Domi reversed. That's something that we literally speculated, but it was sort of something I threw in there as my idea number B, in large part because I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole. I think I intuitively knew that because of hockey, right? A lot of people would not vibe with that idea. Rocks is just too strong. I felt that, so I included it. In my mind, it was a very distinct possibility, but I chose another direction. But I'll 100% sit here now and tell you guys that nothing about this strikes me as off. Rocks is kind of unhinged. He seems a bit emotionally unstable. For him to be uniquely capable of flipping among the very top tiers in the verse, not only do I think that it works, I kind of love it. Not only to potentially unravel the mystery of Emu's abilities, but how this might also relate to unrevealed things about Rocks' character. Like, for instance, is Rocks somebody who fears more than others? This is another thing that I would also like to speculate about Emu. Emu is somebody that seems to like other people, their slaves accomplishing their tasks for them. They may not involve themselves directly in things that are happening. Is Emu also, similar to sort of how his powers work, guy or person that's full of fear? Because in my opinion, the way that Emu makes sense as an immortal being is that Emu is afraid of death. Way more than your average person. As always, I'll include links in the description to relevant videos, but in prior videos, we've discussed possible parallels with, for instance, Usopp, Davy Jones, and the Davy clan. We've also speculated that Usopp might actually be a member of the Davy clan, and Usopp and fear, those things are related, right? So another way to potentially look at Rocks is he a guy who fears losing his treasure more than other people. Just something that comes to mind for me is Usopp's reaction upon learning that Luffy intended to abandon the Going Merry. Could Rox be a person that's similar to this, but twisted in an interesting way because he's also like one of the most powerful people, who unlike Usopp doesn't have any reasonable reason to fear any harm coming to him himself, like he'll probably win the fight. But the same can't be said of Eris and Teach. Also, I guess the last thing that I want to say about this, and this is really a shot in the dark, but something I noticed and I think is interesting enough to point out, what Imu told Rox before Rox flipped was that, Rox, you are going to be the one to take out your own family. And why this is interesting to me is I wonder if this is something that Rox had always feared. Not necessarily because of Imu, but Rox believed that he endangered his own family, and this was a thought that predated the events in God Valley. I mean, real talk, right? Rox jumped through all of these hoops to keep Eris and Teach's identity secret and keep them safe. In my opinion, this is likely because Rox believed that he was a threat to his own family and wanted to separate them from him. So Imu might have struck the right chord in this moment, like specifically tugging at a fear that Rox already had. And if you add up everything that we've speculated over the course of the last 15 minutes or so, I just really like what Oda has potentially done. Because to me, it makes it seem as though Imu really thought out and planned God Valley so that we would have this moment in this chapter with Rox being flipped. To me, it's almost another version of the hunting game overlapping the actual hunting game that's occurred. Imu lured Rox to his home island. Imu dangled the carrot of Rox's family in front of him, also that eventually, at the beginning of this flashback, Rox challenged Imu, right? Imu has now finished the fight and come out victorious. But look, you guys already know how Oda does it, right? There could be a heel turn, there could be a plot twist at any moment. Like, at the end of this chapter, we see Rox beginning to transform. There is absolutely no guarantee that Rox transforms all the way, or that Rox is not capable or able to reverse the transformation using his willpower. Oda could 100% do something like this because it would also serve to reveal some aspects of Imu's abilities which we might need to know. The only caveat to all of this is we already know, eventually, that Garp and Roger team up to defeat Rox. Right now, as Rox is a demon, this makes a lot of sense, right? We could potentially be at the reason why this fight eventually happens and Rox has to die. So if Rox transforms back or reverts back to the human state, right, you would need some other reason for Garp and Roger to team up to defeat him. The ideas that we have presented in prior chapter reviews, which I do think are still plausible, assuming that the demonization goes away, is one, perhaps before Rox does this, he actually first kills his wife. He then comes back to as a human and just loses his mind, or, goes on a rampage. He breaks something to that effect. That seems plausible to me. The other idea, which we talked about in the last chapter review, it's really difficult to explain. I recommend that you just watch that if you want sort of my justification for this. The other thing is that potentially Rox transforms into a Tot Musica type monster. In the last chapter, Imu asks Saturn if Rox is dead, and Saturn says, "I could not say, this is also unexpected. If anything, there is a danger that such wanton destruction might bring about the birth of something entirely new." And then Imu responds to this, "That must not happen." So there is a universe where Imu is literally intentionally transforming Rox into a demon, a slave demon, to avoid something even worse happening. So I just want to remind you that there's a possibility that after this, something even worse happens to Rox, that even Imu appears to fear. But yeah, some final thoughts on Rox. I had some notes jotted down, but I couldn't fit in when to discuss them at the right time. This review is getting a bit disorganized, chaotic. But Imu calls Rox Davy Jones, and Rox says, "You got the wrong guy, I've never met him," which should remind you a lot of Luffy when people might call him Joy Boy or call him Nika. I suppose it most reminds me of Luffy and Kaido's fight on the roof, specifically when Kaido defeated Luffy and he thought to himself, well, I guess you couldn't have been Joy Boy either. This feels like a similar but different moment. So look, this is insanely difficult to discuss because there's far too many possibilities, but a lot of people are already under the impression that Luffy at the very least is the spiritual reincarnation of Joy Boy, either himself or through the Devil Fruit. I am totally, absolutely unsure what I actually think, but another possibility to consider is that, Luffy is not any sort of reincarnation of Joy Boy aside from the fact that he has the same Devil Fruit and therefore the same, perhaps, nature or abilities, but more so, what Luffy's role in the story is to fulfill the promises that Joy Boy made during the Void Century. Also, potentially other promises made in the First World, or for the Joy Boy or the Nika that came before Joy Boy. Not to make it too complex, right? So I definitely prefer this line of thinking with Davy Jones, not that there will be a spiritual reincarnation of Davy Jones, aside from perhaps somebody acquiring Davy Jones's Devil Fruit, but more so there's a person that is destined to attempt to fulfill the promises that Davy Jones made during the Void Century, which would certainly align with what Rox told Imu after Imu made this accusation. I'm not Davy Jones, I've never even met him, however, promises are meant to be kept. And just in general, I think that this chapter encourages you to think about promises in the story of One Piece because, it's everywhere, guys, and it's super important even if we don't fully understand it yet. It's obvious when thinking about Luffy's promise to Shirahoshi, but there's also promises made to Laboon, promises made to the crew, promise to Shanks to return the hat, even promises for a character like Gin in the Baratie arc who promised to meet the Straw Hat Pirates again somewhere in the New World. And what I find to be most interesting about all of this is if you really analyze the specific promise that Luffy might make throughout the course of the story, I believe that he has a 100% hit rate. He always fulfills his promises, even if he suffers defeat or failure. If you think about Ace as an example, Luffy promised to rescue Ace, which he actually did, even though Ace died shortly after he was rescued. But this is very clearly important to Luffy's character. He's kind of the exception to the rule most of the time. If characters in the story might make promises, or throughout history, right, those promises many times will end up unfulfilled. So I think the point is that Luffy will eventually fulfill everyone's promises, including that of Davy Jones. So if you pointed a gun to my head, and remember, we know essentially nothing, but if we were to guess at least one promise Davy Jones made during the Void Century, I would guess that Davy Jones promised to defeat Imu. This is something that it seems as though Rox has inherited. Rox challenged Imu at the very beginning of this flashback, right? It seems central to Rox's motivations to potentially fulfill this promise to defeat Imu. So it really wouldn't shock me if the moral to this story is very reminiscent of a lot of One Piece, but specifically Nami's story in Kokoyashi Village in the Arlong Pirates. Nami needed to ask Luffy for help to fulfill her promise, if not to the village, to herself. It would make a lot of sense to me if Davy Jones and the Davy clan, what they've been missing all along is they need to ask Luffy for help because Luffy fulfills promises. The hypothetical and imaginary story that occurs to me, for instance, is that Davy Jones had a relationship with Joy Boy during the Void Century, had an opportunity to ask Joy Boy for help delivering on his promises, and Davy Jones chose not to do that, potentially out of pride. But the more that I get into this, the less that I want to open this can of worms, because again, there's way too much possibility. Essentially, I've created this headcanon where Blackbeard, as the inheritor of the Davy clan's will, needs to ask Luffy for help, and the memes just make themselves, so I'm gonna stop. Although, it would work so much better if Usopp was actually the direct descendant of Davy Jones, even more than Blackbeard, or there's some sort of equal descendants, right? So Usopp could ask Luffy for help to fulfill his ancestors' will, but I digress. But I suppose to conclude all of this, after Rox said promises are meant to be kept, Imu says, which is exactly why your kind must be erased from history. My current headcanon is that Luffy will fulfill all promises that are still remembered. So Imu's goal here is to erase the Davy clan once and for all so that the promise that Davy Jones made during the Void Century is finally forgotten. If it's forgotten, then Luffy won't fulfill it, and potentially this is Imu's escape route from inevitable death. Because in the story of One Piece, dreams or promises are fated to one day be fulfilled, so long as they are inherited. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, guys, you already know we could speculate all day, but it goes without saying, I'm incredibly excited to see where this goes, and I'm not sold that this is all of the setup to the end game of God Valley. I'm honestly still wondering what will happen to Eris. I'm not convinced that Eris will die. I mean, we talked about it in the last chapter, but there's a connection between Blackbeard and Leloucia, and that doesn't really make sense if both Rox and Eris die. There's so much about this that I feel like we're missing stuff still. But there's a few other things that I want to discuss. In a lot of chapter reviews, we try to sort of analyze what the premise of the chapter itself is, and what is the fulcrum, what connects the entire chapter thematically. And to me, this one is about broken dreams. We got some really entertaining stuff with Captain John, which honestly explains so much about Captain John that I was not anticipating that we would get. You guys remember Captain John's treasure? That was a big deal. To some extent, it was highlighted, you know? And I just kind of thought, oh, Captain John was a pirate after the Rox pirates disbanded or Rox died, and then, you know, collected some amount of treasure on his own. But here it's revealed that John has the magnet fruit the same as Captain Kidd, and uses this ability to collect literally all of the treasure of God Valley. If Captain Johns ends up surviving all of this, it's possible that a lot of this treasure ends up being Captain John's treasure. But there's one particular moment in this chapter where Captain John uses his devil fruit, collects all the treasure simultaneously, such that the treasure is in one piece. And he is the one that controls it or possesses it. So at this precise moment, he metaphorically has obtained everything the world has to offer. And the moment that he acquires this treasure, everyone turns on him, and the treasure is scattered into many pieces. The one piece of treasure is broken into many pieces of treasure as it initially was. So I just think that you could imagine that the pirates that decided to raid God Valley initially, their secret dream was, the biggest, most ambitious dream that they could have had was to acquire all of the treasure of God Valley. This was their dream, and John obtained it, but then it was broken. I'm obviously being a bit overt here, right? But this is something that you could probably compare to the One Piece treasure, which is a treasure, it's also a dream. I think that during the Void Century, Joy Boy was very similar to Captain John and collected everything the world had to offer and left it someplace for people to find. So it's currently in One Piece, but the moment that somebody actually acquires the treasure, everyone will fight over it, and it may split back into many pieces. I'm not entirely sure of how this might work out. It depends on everything that is a part of the One Piece treasure. I'm just saying, like, for sure, this is likely what's going to happen. The moment that One Piece is found, it's going to be similar to Shocky, a treasure that everyone covets and fights over. So anyway, this aside, it just feels like throughout this chapter you can point to various broken dreams. All the Marines here have some dream, most likely relating to justice, and Imu's existence breaks that. This is highlighted with Garp. Like the idea that one true, pure form of justice could exist is probably a lot of Marines in Garp's treasure, and then suddenly it's being broken. Rox is probably talking about some sort of broken promise or a broken dream from the past. Imu also has a dream to erase the Davy clan, which is not yet fulfilled. And at the same time, if you consider the destruction of the Davy clan to be one of Imu's dreams, right, a sort of treasure that they covet, then while all this is happening, a part of the Davy clan, Eris and Teach, are breaking away, attempting to run away. We also have a moment where Big Mom throws a hissy fit because of her dream to acquire the Dragon Devil Fruit for her son, Katakuri. In the chaos, Dragon loses Shanks. Protecting Shanks was his dream. And also specifically a promise that he made to Shanks' mother. But also, before Dragon lost Shanks, he lost Shamrock, so the treasure was already broken. And if you recall from prior chapters, it's pretty apparent that Roger's main dream is to protect his friends, right? And in part of this chapter, we learned that some of Roger's crew was injured, perhaps killed by Imu. And lastly, you have Rox himself. His treasure is his family, and he's in the process of losing them. So all of this is really what the chapter was about. and I suppose how Oda wanted to thematically organize it. Shattered dreams, broken promises, and scattered treasure. But anyway, guys, hopefully this review wasn't too chaotic. It was really difficult to organize my thoughts this week, but hope you enjoyed the video. Obviously banger, next one probably just as much so. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you noticed something from the chapter that I might have missed. Just share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms, link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.